We have been in a series called Deep and Wide, and it's really just been our attempt to discuss what is the purpose of the church. We're starting a church. Okay, what's the purpose of a church? And so we started out, week one, we talked about how just important it is to be planted in the house of the Lord. And then we started, the next week, we started going through the three main purposes that we see in Scripture for the church. And the first one was worshiping God. That's the main purpose, is to worship God. You could say it different ways: glorify God, exalt God, give God praise. But we come here to worship God, to give God all the glory. That's the main purpose. The main purpose is not to get my needs met or to see our friends or whatever, even though that stuff's great too. The main purpose is it's all about God. We honoring God. The second purpose is equipping believers. People that are already Christians, equipping them to go out and to be a light in the darkness. We're going to talk a little bit about that today and about how we can do that. And then week three, or the third purpose, is worshiping God, equipping believers. And last week we talked about evangelizing the world. That's a key purpose of the church, is evangelizing the world. So today I want to go a little bit sort of deeper into that and talk about how. How do we share the good news? How do we share the gospel of Jesus? So Matthew 5, if you have a Bible, if not, we're going to throw it on the screens. It's also in your little handout. And Matthew 5, Jesus says this. He says, "You are the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house." Some of you grew up singing "This Little Light of Mine," and we will not sing that right now. "In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father." Okay, so salt was really valuable back then. I mean, it's valuable today. I mean, it's really everywhere. I mean, it's essential to our health. I mean, we use it in so many different ways, but back then the value of salt was pretty amazing. I mean, Roman soldiers received wages in salt. They called it white gold. In fact, our word salary comes from the Latin word salt. Because of that, because some Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The Greeks considered salt to be divine. I mean, so when this metaphor, this imagery, when Jesus is using this, it's resonating with the people of the day, where we have to kind of do some research and study it and go, well, why is he talking about salt? So Jesus is saying, you are a commodity of the earth. You are you're valuable to the gospel. You're valuable to the world. You are special people. We need you, right? You're the salt of the earth. You're valuable and worth so much to me. And so I want to just go through a few characteristics of salt. If you're taking notes, write these down, and hopefully we'll make the transition from salt to our lives and how this impacts who we should be, why we should be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. So number one, salt adds flavor. If you come to my house and I cook for you and you add salt, I'm offended. Just want you to know, chefs don't like it when you salt their food, right? They already did it, right? But when I go to the Mexican restaurant and they bring those chips, I'm like, is it okay if I salt them? You have to ask the table, right? Is it okay? You dump a bunch of salt on them. Because it just makes everything better. It makes it taste better. It adds so much flavor to anything. You could almost take anything, add a little bit of salt, and it's like, man, that's good, So that's what salt does. It adds flavor. Mark 9:50, salt is good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? You must have the qualities of salt among yourselves and live in peace with each other. So as Christians, spread out all over the world, part of our role is to add flavor to people's lives, to add flavor and make anything that's bland and enhance it by our presence, right? The second characteristic of salt is it preserves life. It preserves life. So in this culture in first century, there was no refrigeration. So they had to preserve meat and fish with salt. It was used also to preserve mummies, which we don't do anymore. But it prevents decay. It prevents corruption. That's what salt does. So we're the salt of the earth. We're called to prevent decay. We're called to preserve people's lives. I think about this when I think about the church. Like the church is here, like if you came in here and you are broken and you want to get your life right with God and things are a mess and we restore people. The church restores people, right? The church spreads the gospel. But you know what? One thing that the church does that's hard to measure is it prevents a lot of destruction. I wonder how many lives the church has saved. I wonder how many suicides the church has prevented. I wonder how many families were on the verge of being torn apart and the church has put them back together. How many marriages have been saved, right? It's like preventative medicine. You're taking medicine to prevent a heart attack or to prevent something bad going wrong. That's why it's so important to consistently be in church, to be connected to a body of believers, because we want to prevent these destructive behaviors and getting off track. And how many people, how many teenagers has the church protected, How many laws has the church preserved, right? So there's a preventative element to the church. But salt preserves life. It doesn't just savor, but it saves. And number 3, salt heals. It's a disinfectant. It heals wounds. Growing up, I'm sure that your mom said the same thing to you when you had a scratchy throat. You need to gargle with salt water, okay? It's like, I don't want to, and then you do it. It's like, well, that actually worked, Salt it's a healing agent, and so we're called to be a healing agent to the world. Number 4, salt also, it changes its environment. It changes its environment. Salt has the ability to change its surroundings. When it sleets and snows, we put salt on it, and it melts. It changes the ice back to liquid. We're called as Christians to set our environment, to set our atmosphere. There's no atmosphere that we're afraid of. There's no atmosphere in our environment that we can't walk in it and bring life to it. There's no darker place. There's no dark place that we can't come in and shine our light. That is our aim, right? To be so courageous, to be so magnetic, to be so loving, to be so kind that it literally changes the temperature of rooms. That's our goal, right? It changes the environment. We can walk into any atmosphere and bring life to it because we're not intimidated, because we don't have to be. We're not insecure because we know who our God is. We're secure in our God. We're called by God. We're confident, not in ourselves, but in God. So we have nothing to be afraid of and no one to be afraid of, right? Salt changes its environment. Number 5, salt makes you thirsty. Jesus said, John 7, I mentioned it earlier in our prayer, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Salt makes you thirsty. Here's a question for you, a good question to ask ourselves. Do you make people thirsty for what you have? Are people thirsty for your faith? Do you make people thirsty by the way that you live? Our life should be so different, so interesting, so unique that people just go, I'm curious about what's going on with you. Like, why are you so joyful, even though I know your life isn't perfect? How are you handling this workplace environment so differently than me, right? How are you being so confident? And what is going on with you? We should make people so curious about how well we treat people, why we treat them that way, and why we're so kind, and make people thirsty. So the church is called to be the salt of the earth. We're called to add flavor to people's life. We're called to make people thirsty. We're called to be on mission. We're called to treat people so well that they're curious about what we have and why we have it. And we could actually have the privilege of being part of people's faith journey by adding life to them, by being a light in the darkness, and by not being boring and weird as Christians, right? That's what we're called to do, salt of the earth. It doesn't have to be complicated. It could actually be very simple. So some of you care deeply. You care deeply about people finding Jesus, people finding Christ. You want that to happen. You have people that you pray for. Some of you care deeply about the church and all that. So I figured it would be good to break it down practically, right? No theoretical stuff, practical. How do I share the good news? How do I share the gospel, right? So there's different ways to do that. And so I just want to give you a few ways that you can do this. And some of you are going to relate with different ways. And I just thought it'd be good to go through this. So number one, how do I share the gospel? Number one, through my words. Through my words. Sometimes you got to use the words, right? My wife, we've been married 20 years. Is she in here? Just making sure. She does this thing where, and I love her so much. I love her so much. She does this thing where across the room, when she doesn't want me to hear what she's saying, but she wants to communicate across the room, but she doesn't want to say it out loud, she'll mouth it like I can read lips. I'm like, it's been 20 years. I don't know what you're saying. So I'll literally go, I can't hear you. She's like, that's the point. I'm like, I can't hear that either. I'm like, just use your words. It happened this week. It's been 20 years. And even if I could, I wouldn't admit it. You know what I mean? At this point, I'm sticking to my story, right? Sometimes you got to use the words. How do we share the gospel? Sometimes we have to use our words. So when I got my bachelor's degree in Bible, we had a whole class on evangelism. And for the first, 75% of the semester, we were in a classroom setting. We're learning about the scriptures and evangelism and the way, and the stats and all the things, right? And then the last few weeks, last month or whatever, we went out and we shared the gospel with people, and it was very uncomfortable for me. And so we each had locations around the city. Well, my location was Hendrix College, and Hendrix College is a liberal arts college. It's very liberal. There's not a whole lot of cute Christians running around there, right? It's just and they're smart people, right? And I'm not that smart, and so that's where I was like, oh man, I got Hendrix. These people are smart, man. And they're, that was our grade. We got graded on how God moved in people's lives at Hendrix. I'm like, that's not fair. But I remember sitting in the car. I was like, oh man, I'm young. I'm like, 21 years old, or whatever. And I'm like, go share the gospel. What did I sign myself up for? And I just remember going out and doing surveys and spiritual questionnaires. And it was actually pretty amazing how open people were. And I would share the gospel with people. And sometimes they were rude, but most of the time they weren't. And it was just really a cool experience. Colossians 4, verse 5 and 6 says, conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you know how you should respond to each person. So ultimately, it's not our job to save people. We can't save people. We can't really win people. It's really God's job. Our job is to be obedient and do what we feel like we're called to do. And I had to learn this as a preacher, right? You know, especially in my younger years, I was like, who wants to get saved? And no one raised their hand. It's like, I'd be devastated. And now it's like, well, that's on to the next week, you know? I mean, it's not my job to save people, right? It's the Holy Spirit that draws people. But we do have to use our words sometimes. Number two, through my life. Through my life. Another way that you can share the gospel is just through your life. Be a good person, right? Be a loving person. It's so simple. Just pre-service, I was at the kids and there's little coloring sheets and it was like, just be kind. That was the coloring sheet. I was like, I raised the paper up to some of the volunteers, like, if people would just do this, right? No more theology lessons for some people. Just do this, right? Just be nice. No one really knows who this quote is from. Some people think it was St. Francis of Assisi, but you probably heard it before. Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. Now, they're not saying that you shouldn't use words. They're just saying, you know what people are influenced by the most is your life. It's your life. 2 Corinthians 2, Paul says, but thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph in Christ and manifests through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of him in every place. For we are a fragrance of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To one, an aroma from death to death. To other, an aroma from life to life. We are an aroma of Christ. So everywhere we go, people are smelling us. They're smelling us. They're catching vibes, right? It's important that we live an authentic life in front of people. Now, sometimes that's being so spiritual, right? And then other times it's saying, like some of you did earlier, you know what? I need prayer. You're talking to me. And that doesn't mean I'm less than, and that doesn't mean I'm a horrible person, and that doesn't mean I'm falling apart. All it means is, hey, you're speaking to me, and I have enough courage to say that's me, and I'm going to live an authentic, real life, right? That's a great example of just living a life of authenticity in front of people. There are people watching you, right? People, they're catching vibes from your life. Number three, another way that we can share the gospel is through my intentionality. My intentionality. Jesus intentionally entered our world. He came down to humanity. He entered into our mess, and he was very intentional about how he lived. Here's a few sub-points here, some more practical things. Intentionally befriend people who are different than you. Befriend people that are different than you. It is our natural impulse to only be friends with people that are like us. No church bubbles, right? We don't want church bubbles. If everybody understands this insider language, then we're doing something wrong. Like, we got to get out of the bubble. We have to care enough to reach out and to be friends with people who are not like us. One of the most fascinating things about Jesus is that people that were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. He was so curious about people's lives. He was so intentional with people. He was a friend of sinners. He was criticized for loving people that were different than him, that other people thought were less than him, and he did not care. His harshest statements, because Jesus was, people think, oh, Jesus, he was nice to everybody. Not really. There were some people he's pretty harsh towards. He was perfectly harsh towards them, right? And it was the religious leaders and the Pharisees who thought they were better and had all the rules. And he just didn't really speak that well of them. He befriended people that were different than him. So it takes intentionality to not insulate ourselves to just people like us. I had a guy that is always, work out, basketball. So I do some things that I intentionally put myself with people that probably aren't here today, or aren't in church. And one guy that I don't even know if he goes to church, but he had a couple kids. He's like, hey, he's from New York. He's like, hey, I need you to baptize my kids. I was like, oh, right now? Like the gym, sauna and pool, whatever, hot tub, what are you thinking? He said, I just need you to baptize my kids. I was like, well, how old are they? It's 6 months and 1 year or something like that. 6 months and 2 years, whatever. I was like, oh, well, we don't do that. We have baby dedications, child dedications. And then when the children are old enough to make a faith decision, then we'll baptize them. He's like, what? I was like, yeah, so I'm breaking this down for him. I want to be around people like that. Because people like that, that's who needs me. That's who needs you. People that don't know. We want people in our church that don't know. If you don't know, it's fine. We're going to teach you. We're going to equip you. We don't live in a Christian bubble who everyone understands everything. There's people that this is a baby step. Some of you are here and you're baby stepping in. You're in the shallow end. So you don't even know what you think about God. And we're glad that you're here. I remember there was a girl that got saved in our church a while back. Not this church, another church. And she went to go get a Bible. She didn't have a Bible. She's like, I guess I need a Bible. And she was like, she didn't understand all the translations. She's like, there was NASB and the NIV and the NLT and me. And she was like, I got so overwhelmed, I just walked out of the Christian bookstore. So we helped her find a Bible. And these are real people, right? We want to befriend people that need help, that need us. Also, intentionally find common ground with people. These are just practical things. Intentionally find common ground with people. I always encourage people, find the 1% where you agree with people and give it 100% of your effort. Find the 1% where you agree and give it 100% of your effort, where a lot of people do the opposite. They find the 1% where they disagree and give it 100% of their effort. And it's divisive. Enter into their world. Ask questions. Win people over. And then also intentionally add value to people. Add value to people. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And Christians, it's so sad, aren't known for how much they care. Isn't that wild? We should be known how much we care. We should add value. We should plant seeds into people's lives. There's something that I learned in Bible school called the Ingle scale. And it was developed by this, it's a man-made little thing, a diagram, and it's like a stair step, and it shows people's faith journey. It was developed by a guy named James Ingle. And the Ingle scale, it's in the middle is you're saved, right? And then it goes through these 7 steps. So -7 would be uninterested. And then the next step would be sort of interested. And then once you get to 0, it's you make a decision. You make a faith decision. And then it's be discipled. And so the point is, our job maybe is to get people one step closer, right? Let's be a part of people's faith journey. It's not an overnight process for a lot of people. It can be. It can be an encounter with God, but we're here, we're playing the long game. We're being a part of people's faith journey. I just want to get you to the next step. I just want to get you to the next step. 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, each of us, he's talking about him and some of his buddies that you'll see, each of us did the work the Lord gave us. I planted the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. The one who plants and the one who waters work together with the same purpose, and both will be rewarded for their hard work. We are rewarded as we plant seeds into people's lives, as we add value, as we water those seeds, all we know is we're being obedient. All we know is we're adding value to people. We're being the salt of the earth. We're being the light of the world. We're adding value. So much easier to share about the Jesus that you love when you're adding value to people. When people know how much you care, when you're nice for people, when you offer to pray for people, when you care about them, when you make their lives better, when you don't judge them, when you speak life over them, when you're a blessing with your words, right? When you're asking them questions about their life and curious about them, when you kind of just stop talking and listen, right? So much easier to share about your faith. They're going to be so much more open because you have relational equity with them. We've had people come back to our church because I remember their name. Why are you here? You remember my name? Oh gosh. Do I remember everybody's name? Is this really up to my memory here? But it just goes to show you that people are open as we add value. So we can share the gospel just through being intentional. And then number 4, we can share the gospel through our church. Through our church. Hopefully Legacy Church is a place where you can invite your friends. Invite people that haven't been in church in a while. We're always going to preach the truth. And I don't think we would ever embarrass them. It would never be intentional to embarrass anybody. We're not going to, there's no snake handling stuff going on here, right? So we want to be a safe place. It might disrupt their lives because that's what Jesus does. You know what I mean? I guess that would probably be the hope. I'm thankful that God disrupted my life. It's been the best thing that's ever happened in my life. Was a holy disruption, but will never embarrass you and your friends. Easter is coming, a great day to invite people. Proverbs 11 verse 30 says, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who is wise wins souls. So the church is always a great place to share the gospel, to evangelize, because the music is already here. You can't recreate this. If you can, you need to join the team today. The sermons are already being preached. The gospel's already being shared. We already have the space rented. We already have childcare, right? We already have everything provided, so all you have to do is invite. It's the easiest way, simplest way to share your faith is come to my church, sit with me. What coffee do you want? I'll have it ready for you. You know, that kind of a thing. And the church will do what they do and you do what you do. You may not want to be the preacher, and you don't have to be. You can just be friendly and invite people. So through my church. And then number 5, through my story. Through my story. It's hard to argue with people's stories. Well, I don't really believe in all that God stuff. Okay, well, I was it's hilarious. I thought you slapping the bass back there, man. You're good. Just making sure you're okay. I was like, did he fall? Through your story, it's hard to argue with people's story. You know what I mean? Like, you tell people your story, it's like, well, how do I argue with that, right? I mean, yeah, people are crazy, they're crazy, but not everybody's crazy, right? I can't. Well, you don't believe in God, but my marriage was, we were about to be divorced and blah, blah, and then this happened and this happened. It's like, stories are really powerful. Some of you have some great stories about how God has rescued you, saved you, healed you, encouraged you. I've got a few stories that it's like, they serve as milestone moments for me forever. Like when my faith is weak, I reflect back on those encounters. You know what I mean? Acts 1:8 says this, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere. In Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Well, what is a witness? It's not a salesman, really. It's not a lawyer. A witness just tells their account. It tells their story. So we can be witnesses just by sharing our story. It's a really easy way to share about your faith. It's much different than like, hey, let me tell you about Jesus, right? It's very abrupt sometimes as you're pouring coffee with your coworker or whatever, you know. But naturally just sharing your story, you know, that means a lot to people. That's another way that you can share the gospel, especially when you share your struggles. I'll tell you what people can resonate with, and that's brokenness. You talk about times when you were broken. Oh, they're listening. That's why anytime I get stuck in my sermon prep, I just start thinking, okay, when was I broken? You know, when was I stuck? When was I worried? Because we all deal with that. So when you share your struggles, it resonates with people. We're all witnesses to the saving grace of Jesus. So when I was, one of the first times I ever preached was, I think I was 20 years old, and I preached this youth event, and I didn't know what I was doing. You know what I mean? So I was preaching, and then I did an altar call, and two people came up, and they gave their hearts to Christ. 2 teenagers, 2 girls. A few years later, one of those girls was abducted and murdered. And I didn't know at the time. I knew about the story, but I didn't know it was her. And then the pastor of that church who had me in for that event, that youth event, called me and told me, you know, that girl was one of the 2 at that youth event that came forward and got on her knees, and we prayed for her, and she gave her heart to Christ. That was her. And it was so early on in my ministry or whatever, that it just showed me the value of every person, the value of every soul, and the value of eternity. Would you bow your head? I just want to pray for you.